other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
If you want to get a sub-faction of the Transformers community arguing in an instant, all you need to do is mention anything to do with exclusives. Limited number exclusives, store exclusives, crowdfunded exclusives. There's always someone somewhere ready to argue about how amazing or terrible their existence is. Whatever side you fall on though, there are things to criticize about the system. In recent years, we've seen rare characters that would otherwise never sell at regular retail. Like Ratchets, and Soundwave, and the main Seekers, and Cosmos. Yes, because a mainline Cosmos wouldn't sell at all. That said, although there are many things to criticize about Hasbro's current way of doing things, it's always important to look back and remember what was. In the long past era of 5 years ago, back when you could comfortably shake the hand of a random stranger on the streets, exclusives were a much more erratic affair. Instead of giving us obscure nobodies that could never be released on regular store shelves without forcing the store to stop carrying Transformers entirely, they were simply used to pack whatever the designers felt like on any given day. Not to say these were all bad. That very year gave us one of my current grails. Yeah, it's not that crazy a grail, but in my defense, my higher priority ones got filled in already. That said, the majority were, not figures to bat an eye at. As such, it's important to look back at these figures sometimes, so we can appreciate how things are in the grand scheme of things. Greetings, Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and welcome back to another Second Opinion. In today's diagnosis, we're discussing a figure that nobody really cares about, except my patrons for some reason. Last night, Reveal the Shield Voyager class Optimus Prime. And before you ask, no, this has no relation to the Reveal the Shield branding from 2010. No rub signs here, just one of the weirdest intrusive gimmicks I've ever seen. So what exactly is this Optimus Prime supposed to be? What's the story? What are the deets? Well, to be honest, it's a pretty convoluted series of events. For starters, we have to go back even further, over a decade ago to 2011. Dark of the Moon releases, and Hasbro has altered their engineering ideology due to complaints from parents about overcomplexity. Leader class Optimus Prime is seen as patient zero. Although some kids find it perfectly acceptable, little Dr. Lockdown included, most parents are sending in unfavorable reviews, so they shift focus from panel-based conversion to simpler chunk-based ones, a style that would eventually evolve into the current Studio Series style we see today. Put a pin in this shift though, because it's going to come back later. Now we go back to 2017 with the release of The Last Knight. The toy line is, to put it bluntly, pretty messy. Perhaps it was due to the film's wacky development, cutting out a whole hour at the last minute for reasons we're still quite not sure. Maybe Hasbro didn't know the specifics of the film, so they couldn't formulate a toy line properly around it, or perhaps it was because they were simply buying time until Studio Series kicked off. Their Premiere Edition lineup acted as a sort of prototype for the eventual fan favorites, featuring many of the hallmarks such as a greater emphasis on screen accuracy, more mature transformations, and a higher adherence to scale. Some Last Night toys even found their way into the line through redecos and retitles. Although perhaps I'm giving the line too much credit because that was only half the releases. The other half was obviously undercooked and lacking in care, which is emblematic of the line as a whole. It's clear that Hasbro just didn't have the resources and all the care at the time to put much effort into their store exclusives. Even the poster child himself got shit out as a half-baked retool. Still waiting on that supposed eventual Studio Series release, by the way. Personally, I lean more on the side of the resources being stretched too thin as opposed to genuine laziness. But whatever the case, this was probably the weakest movie line. So, what do you do when you really don't have any fodder for store exclusives but still have to put something out to keep retailers on board, lest you end up losing them like David Jones? Why, you pull something out of your ass, of course. Introducing the Reveal the Shield subline, likely because the trademark was still sitting in a drawer somewhere. What does this subline consist of? A pack of tiny turbo changes, a couple of one-steps, and a released Dark of the Moon Voyager that didn't even release in Australia. Yeah, this guy dropped in, I think, Walmart in the US, Argos in the UK, and I distinctly remember seeing it in Kaboom in Changi Airport, Singapore while traveling to Greece. Ended up getting Twin Twist instead, which was good because all my local stores skipped him, much like the entirety of Australia skipped this fellow. It's funny because Hasbro Australia had a couple of these lying around at their headquarters at the time, and gave one to a friend of mine. You've actually seen him cameo recently with the previous review. I stole it from him. That's how I was able to obtain mine. That said, why this Prime specifically? No real reason at all. 2007 Optimus Prime's re-release at least had the reason of it's a nostalgic toy that a lot of people are finally old enough to afford. Sort of in line with the Beast Wars reissues, minus the price. RTS Prime doesn't have that excuse. He wasn't regarded fondly when he was first released because most fans were still ejaculating over the release of the Battle Blades version, and he doesn't evoke the aesthetic of any previous incarnations. His just sort of there. That said, while understanding the context of a figure is important in establishing base knowledge, ultimately we need to judge a toy based on what it is, not what it isn't. It's like the new Wrecker's Bulkhead. Sure, it's not animated Bulkhead, it's not Pyro, it's not Heatwave, but as a double homage to Bulkhead and Age of Extinction Hound, it's pretty good. So, over 1,050 words into this script already, we can finally ask, how does this figure fare on its own? Well, in vehicle mode, predictably, pretty bad. Like, I will end up explaining this in detail, but right off the bat, it's at least obvious, right? Like, you can look at this and instantly tell, yes? The biggest issue from the get-go, even ignoring the engineering conundrums and tolerance kerfuffles, is that it's trying to juggle too many aesthetics at once. Personally, I'm not a fan of clear decos due to a mix of longevity concerns and personal preferences, but whenever it does work, it typically sticks to 1 or 2 shades of clear and 2 shades max in other colors, just for consistency. RTS Prime juggles 3 shades of clear plastic, 4 shades of opaque plastic, and to add aesthetic insult to injury, none of it is properly blocked out. Everything sort of starts and stops abruptly because this mold just wasn't designed for random colors to be changed. The top section is done in clear blue because of how a certain aesthetic I'll discuss later was blocked out. Because of how it sits awkwardly on top of everything, it makes the truck mode feel awfully unfinished, especially towards the window. They could have painted it opaque like the original, but apparently that was too much effort. And not only is the fully unpigmented window section pretty ugly in the context of everything around it, but it's face planting right into 2 other clear colors. This whole section feels like a bad 3D printing project. I've seen fan works with more cohesion than this. The gas canisters on the side look pretty bad too. On the original, it was a deliberate stylistic choice to tie into the armored up mech tech aesthetic, similar to that seen on Nitro Bumblebee. Not sure he'll ever get a second opinion, by the way. I've since sold him off. The original canisters had the benefit of a muted color palette though, allowing them to gel with the overall design. In this bright transparent red, however, they don't look like they're attached to the design at all. And yes, I get that red and blue is commonly associated with Optimus Prime. He's supposed to be red and blue, and here we have clear red and clear blue, and opaque red and opaque blue, and clear plastic windows, and metallic silver, and matte grey, and whatever these are supposed to be. Do you see the problem here? It's too much. It looks like a kid's coloring book was turned into a toy. Actually, scratch that. Last time that happened, it actually turned out awesome. Still, credit where credit is due, the transparent reels are actually pretty neat. They're even pins, something we don't see very often due to modern budget constraints. Off the top of my head, the only recent example is the upcoming Velocitron Override, presumably so she can roll better and justify the Voyager price tag. And on the topic of rolling better, RTS Prime doesn't. Yes, the entire purpose of pinwheels is to make the rolling feel more seamless. Yes, with the way the legs are tolerant, they always seem to bow in the middle. I'm not sure if this is poor quality control or mold degradation or just general engineering problems since so few people own this version to compare to, but either way, it's an annoyance. Still, if anyone in the comments owns this figure and theirs rolls just fine, I'll pin the comment and take back that complaint. That's not the only engineering issue though, the back suffers pretty bad as well. Initially, I was pretty frustrated with the hollowness between the feet, but these days, I don't mind so much. This is actually how a truck works. People just don't realize it when they've become accustomed to the feet chilling back there. Off the top of my head, only this, Leader Prime, SS-38, and MP-44 get this section quote-unquote correct. Interesting to see, but the hollow back section, on the other hand, is frustrating to see. Not a fan of hollowness on vehicle modes. A few hollow limbs on a robot is fine, but there had to be a better way to do this. Grabbing that pinned thought from earlier, the issues with this section stem from incompatible engineering philosophies. As mentioned earlier, the transformation was deliberately simplified as a result of whinging parents. How do they achieve this? By keeping the original limb chunks but removing the extra panels. On an 09 Revenge of the Fallen mold, these would have had extra panels that folded around to assist with visual cohesion, but with this new engineering system they were still working out the kinks. In fact, there's a very clear line of evolution between this Prime and future ones, so it's possible to see what happens when they're able to refine this system. When I first acquired this figure, another friend of mine ended up bringing first edition Prime to the event, because it was Prime Optimus Prime being brought to a Power of the Primes event. Yes, that was an attempt at a pun. Don't look at me, I didn't come up with it. I'm merely recounting. When comparing this figure to his first edition Prime, I initially remarked that the two felt very similar. I even said such in the original review, no less. Today though, I actually have my own version of that mold. And comparing the two, yeah, Dark of the Moon Prime is basically a prototype for first edition Prime. You can see that while it looks a smidge messy, it's much better as they've had the time to refine this system of play. As such, maybe it's not fair to be too harsh on this. It was a hard thing to do back then, and they had to sacrifice a lot of things. Sure, modern interpretations are better, but for the time, I don't mind this. Can't say the same for the front section. Christ, this is messy. Much like the back, this is a dead ringer for the eventual first edition Prime style. Only garbage. This is an absolute mess of a nose, nothing covering up the thigh so they can clearly be seen from most angles. Weird rounded hinges that lead to the obvious faux chest in the middle, random side chunks that jut out with the canisters, no color cohesion with the top section. The last two don't even make sense because these are kibble that serve no purpose in robot mode. These panels could have literally been any color since they just end up on the arms, and the angle kibble just ends up on the back. What gives? It's just plain amateur, especially compared to previous Voyager offerings. And no, I'm not including Battle Blades Prime. Might be a hot take, but I find that mold kinda wacky. One thing it did have though was an understanding about how the back doors were offset. On this version, they're mirrored. I'm not an accuracy nut, but now knowing how it's actually supposed to work, it just seems lazy. But all of these complaints, I've discussed everything without mentioning the elephant in the room. Who the vomited over the roof? Ladies and gentlemen, introducing the first ever intrusive gimmick that also falls under the color scheme category. Tech spec paintwork. So back in G1, every box came with a tech spec decoder. That is, a piece of transparent red plastic that revealed the statistics of any given character. The same technology was also brought back for the Earthrise box gimmick, revealing planet names and locations on the combined map. The gimmick in itself is fine and all, but not on a physical transformer. Here, Prime comes with a sword and a shield. I've since lost the sword, and I can't access it anymore due to frustrating circumstances. As such, whenever I pose him, I'll use this sword I got from a Renderform clearance sale. Just pretend this actually well-designed sword is the boring one that comes with the actual figure. Either way, these are both ridiculously generic, and even though the wiki states that these are entirely new molds, I seriously doubt this claim. There had to be a CAD file lying around for these somewhere. No way they put in all the effort into making something this bland. But whatever, the idea is that you hold up the red plastic against these coded sections to reveal the hidden bottom con symbols. It works well enough, at the cost of the aesthetic. For all I've complained about in relation to everything else, chances are you're not going to notice thanks to these goddamn things. Because they have to display two-dimensional symbols instead of one-dimensional lines, they have to compensate by making the shapes meant to hide them much more random. As a result, the blue and red splotches give the impression that Hasbro decided to paint this thing during Parmesan hour, or potentially vomiting on the thing after said Parmesan hour. What's even more annoying is that these act as replacements for the existing aesthetic. Solar panels on top meant to symbolize his alliance with humanity, strengthened with the humans over the course of 3 films. This is actually why the top section is blue now. It was fully painted on the original, so the panels could bleed through without making a separate part. It isn't accurate in any way, but at least it's unique. This deco isn't just bad, it's stripping away the core idea that made the original so distinct. I don't even know why it's like this to begin with. I get this doesn't have any relation to it, but couldn't they just do what the original Reveal the Shield line did back in 2010 with rub signs? And even if they did want to use this tech spec paint scheme, maybe it could have worked with a primarily white color scheme. Had they committed to the bit enough, it might have succeeded. But nope, gotta go with that clear shit. That's where this figure fails. It's trying to balance too much nonsense on top of what should just be a simple Optimus Prime. The original was a mix of Movieverse Prime with solar panels and a darker, richer color scheme. Cool, it has issues, but it works. Then you've got Fireburst Prime, which gives it a lava aesthetic. Even better, makes everything gel properly. Actually, I kinda want that figure at some point. But then this figure adds extra clear plastic, and another shade of clear plastic, and weapons that don't store very well save for the shield, and extra paint on top of the solar panels that makes them look ridiculously out of place. Like, those panels didn't go anywhere. They're still there, you're just adding layers and layers of jank on top so you can sell it as an exclusive to get extra last night toys into a retailer. It's an exclusive for the sake of being an exclusive. They haven't thought anything through. Honestly, G1 Slapdash should get a new name because Optimus Prime here holds that title much more. Slapdash is shit. It's such a mess that I can't really point to one thing and say, maybe you'll like this mode if you like this. Closest I can think of is the transparent wheels, but really, who gives a shit? Christ, really puts into perspective how f***ed up some clear plastic actually is. I think I owe Legacy Black Convoy an apology after this shit. Anywho, sizing. Only thing noteworthy about this is Dark of the Moon is when figures started getting smaller. Retailers were pushing the prices to stay the same and corners had to be cut. I think Megatron had it the worst out of all the Voyagers, but either way, it shouldn't bother you if you're primarily a modern collector. Not that you'd really want to get this figure for this mode though. Really, no point here. I'm honestly getting a headache looking at this thing now, so maybe it's time to move on. So as mentioned earlier, Dark of the Moon Optimus Prime, and by extension the Last Night Reveal the Shield Optimus Prime, is a sort of prototype for Prime First Edition Optimus Prime. Yeah, that's a lot of primes in a sentence, and it took about 7 minutes to get that take. As such, you end up with a lot of cool ideas on show, but because of the clash in engineering ideologies, they all seem to come across as underbaked. Like, it's not just this section here, it's the conversion as a whole that suffers for it. Now, one thing I will say say, the legs are absolutely fantastic. To access them, you want to get rid of these little panels on the side here with the canisters, and that will allow you to plug this section off the top and bring it down a little bit. The feet rotate outwards like that. You can bring the whole assembly down on the ratchets, separate them like so. The wheels will slightly separate and angle downwards a little bit, which will give you enough clearance for the wheels to transform. Said wheels rotate into the side. You've got a nice locking point and they go in like that. You'll notice there's a slot there and a peg there, and that's how that works. And then last but not least, these double hinges rotate everything into the back like so, with that little smokestack sticking up. This transformation is bloody brilliant. I have never seen anything on a Transformer like this. Not even the first edition does this. It does sort of a modification, and it's not as satisfying. Just the way everything folds in with all the panels and all that stuff, it's so satisfying. Oh, and by the way, as a heads up, these legs actually rotate ever so slightly so they can peg together on these little hinges at the back there. But usually you don't notice it. Usually you just transform it and it's completely invisible. These panels rotate 100% to the front like so. Well, I say panels, but they're really gas canisters. The head pops up. You will need a fingernail in there, and you got a hole there and a peg there, and they lock together, locking the head in place. These parts unpeg from the sides like so. That you get. And from this point, these rotate outwards and they rotate up and lock into place here. I really wish there was a locking tab at the back here so that they stayed in place instead of just flopping around, but it is what it is. Come around to the front and these sections slide down ever so slightly. Then you can untab the panels from those two holes there and they rotate down like so. You can then untab the arms like that and the shoulder pads kind of rotate outwards. You then use this single hinge and that becomes the chest, and it locks in place with the two shoulder parts like so. The chest conversion is a cool idea, but once again, the first edition version did it better. And of course, by extension, the two Studio Series offerings, because they use the same conversion as well. Because it really juts out in the vehicle mode, whereas those versions actually collapse inward, and it works incredibly well. Anywho, the arms just untab with the little tabs there, or I suppose the pegs there, and then they rotate around the way they're supposed to go. It's kind of supposed to go with inward elbows, which I'll get into because that is the molding from the movie. It's a bit of a blunder there, but whatever, I will discuss that later. And the backpack will probably come undone in the process, but whatever. The wrists rotate into place on the ball joints. Last but not least, come around to the back, rotate up the wheels because they are on their own separate hinges, completely separate from these pins on the wheels as well, so they definitely went all out there. And we are done. So there's a lot of really cool ideas. It's honestly a cool transformation, but it's not quite there. It doesn't quite gel together like a lot of modern transformations do, or a lot of Dark of the Moon voyages either, like Megatron or Skyhammer. Those ones felt purposeful with that aha moment, and yeah, this kind of has the aha moment with the legs, but there's not really enough here to keep you interested overall, which is unfortunate. But hey, it paved the way for better figures, so for that, at least I can cut it some slack.
Now, the vehicle mode was a train wreck, or I suppose a truck wreck. No getting around it. That said, not a lot of people end up displaying their figures in vehicle mode, so there may be a crowd out there that can find some semblance of enjoyment out of this if the robot mode delivers. And you know what? Even with everything I've said, the robot mode is actually okay. It's definitely not perfect. There are issues around every corner. There are also really neat things to enjoy too, though. For instance, the legs. These are probably the coolest legs I've seen on a Voyager-priced movie, Optimus Prime. I've gone over it before in the transformation, but it bears repeating. Engineering and looks-wise, these are awesome. The way these incorporate the side and top panels seamlessly, along with the wheel fold-around that sort of reminds me of another Dark of the Moon figure, that being Ironhide, all the way to the hints of the solar panels on the knees. It's seriously breathtaking. Sure, I find it pretty funny that they molded fake wheels into the thighs, forever doomed to remain unpainted due to the plastic used. But these things, although not accurate, are seriously well designed. Although perhaps it's a fool's errand, given as far as accuracy is concerned, this figure is anything but. Still, he even has built-in ankle tilts, a rarity for Voyagers at the time. Although annoyingly, the kibble struts get in the way. You have to move them back a bit to access the full range of motion, but hey, on a figure this old, it's still commendable. Unfortunately, due to the conversion, he ends up with a criminally short torso in comparison to the limbs. Like, you thought Legacy Prime was bad? This is on a whole other level. In this instance, though, I think it kinda works. In my initial shitty review, I described this as having anime proportions, which isn't really accurate. It's more anime super robot proportions. Take a look at any popular Japanese humanoid mech from the 90s onwards and you'll notice similar hallmarks. Where Legacy Prime feels a bit weird since he teeters on the edge of this aesthetic, Dark of the Moon Prime leans hard into it. It comes across as a more deliberate stylization instead of just being a leggy boy. Unfortunately, when it comes to the torso, a lot of that deliberate stylization gets covered up with the designer's poor effort to tie in the vehicle mode aesthetic. I appreciate the amount of silver used, picking out the collar, tie, and midriff references pretty well, but instead of painting the windows like a sane person, they've replaced the section with that awful blood vomit from earlier. Although I suppose it's better than the blood and liquid paper and Windex splatter from the vehicle mode, which has all migrated to easily ignored kibble panels around the robot. Still, it's hard to praise a lot of the cool shit on this chest when aside from the silver shoulder spikes, everything is pretty much the same from the original. The silver isn't improving on anything, and the red splatter is just making things worse. Also don't care for the conspicuous dip behind the chest, almost going below the shoulder line. Gives me flashbacks to the hollow sections on Combiner Wars Skywarp, a toy I don't talk about often because Jesus, that thing is shit. Still can't show comparisons though because, well, you know. I also feel the shoulders could be a little higher, given the super robot aesthetic, but as they stand, they've got some nice paintwork on show. Sure, the placement is basically the same as the original, but the red now has a slight metallic fleck to it. Also doesn't have any blue bleed from underneath, save for the deliberate panel lines. Massive kudos seeing them tackle one of the most difficult colors to do on such a dark shade. And you wouldn't know it since it doesn't appear anywhere else on the robot mode. Every other shade is tamper-graphed. Come on, mate, share the love. Don't give me the cold shoulder. Around the back, you get a pretty hefty serving of kibble. Honestly, though, I don't really mind the placement of it. I kind of miss creative uses of backpack kibble these days. Typically, Hasbro tries to leave it hanging around loosely or just get rid of it. Neither options are bad, but this kind of stuff was neat. Actually, to be fair, we are still getting a few cases these days, but the point still stands. There's also the unintentional feature of fan moding into shoulder cannons. Although a bit hollow, I dig how this looks, especially thanks to the transparent red. My main gripe is that it just doesn't stay in place. These back pins really don't support the weight, and without a tab to lock everything in place, the modules just flop around whenever you try to pose the guy. It's honestly the only thing I'd change back here, even with the existence of a retooled version that only ever saw a release by Takara. Kinda find it funny they tried to make this guy more accurate when the original intent of the mold was to be anything but. Sort of like making a drift out of Skyhammer. Oh. Wait. The head sculpt is kinda, I suppose. The base sculpting seems fine enough, but the actual molding feels soft. Haven't handled the original, so I can't really confirm, but I'm willing to bet this is due to mold degradation. If I ever go down the Fireburst rabbit hole, I'm definitely going to have to compare these two. Also, I don't dig the painted over eyes when the intention was to have light piping. It's something the Last Knights loved doing for some reason. I get they backed themselves into a corner with using unpigmented clear plastic on that runner, but leaving them like that would have been preferable over this. Still not my biggest gripe though. That would have to be the arms. Due to the way he's sculpted, it's clear the intended configuration is this way, with the elbows inwards. Due to this, and due to the way the chunks form during transformation, he ends up looking like he's got teeny tiny baby hands attached to giant crab claws. The fandom tends to refer to this as gorilla arms, but I find that not all Transformers with inward elbow designs have the weird proportional jank as well. As such, I always preferred calling it inward elbow syndrome, where the designers make the figure in a way where it's supposed to bend inwards, not forwards. Now, fortunately, you can rectify this by rotating the bicep swivel, since the wrists are ball jointed and can compensate, but honestly, this doesn't look much better with the kibble on the insides of the arms. It also makes the weapon storage really difficult since the pegs get stuck on the truck grille. Still, I appreciate you can compensate like this to begin with, and I appreciate the amount of articulation he has overall. I mean, for fuck's sake, they engineered a waist swivel specifically for the articulation. It isn't used during the transformation like Dark of the Moon Megatron. Between this, the wrists, the double elbows, and the ankles, this is a surprisingly posable figure. Unfortunately, due to the somewhat lackluster color scheme, not a lot of his dynamic poses shine through. Doesn't matter what pose you put him in, they're all so bland. Really, when you take a step back and examine the whole figure, you have to ask yourself, what's drawing you in? The head sculpt looking deader than an obscure Egyptian god? The arms with their odd joint positioning? The backpack? There just really isn't much to get excited about. The legs are great, but they only count for 1/3 of the mode. And it's not like they make a statement on their own like a character along the lines of Shockwave would. During the transformation, all the ugly elements hide themselves away. This is appreciated, but there's nothing enticing hidden under the shell. It's just another Optimus Prime, one that would be fine for little kiddlywinks, but not for serious collectors. And here's the thing, this wasn't marketed at young kids. It was a store exclusive with an inflated price tag, so it was attracting older kids with extra pocket money and adult collectors. Those sorts of people just weren't going to be interested in something like this. And that's just the robot mode. You flip this guy over to his other half and oh boy, what a shit show. It's a perfect cacophony of garbage. As such, in the end, I just can't rate this figure very positively. Thanks to some neat ideas in robot mode and a pretty fun transformation, I don't think it deserves the lowest of scores. But it's definitely one that's an easy skip. Whether the designers were lazy or whether it was corporate meddling or perhaps a bit of both ultimately doesn't matter in the end. We'll never know because the people responsible probably aren't at Hasbro and aren't willing to talk. And in the end, it's an ugly toy. Plain and simple. With better primes on the market at the time, there was no reason to buy it then, and with modern offerings from Studio Series, there still isn't. But oddly enough, for a figure like this, it probably wasn't ever about getting people to buy it, but rather getting stores to stock it. As someone who works at retail, I'll let you in on a not so little secret. General public stores have no clue what they're stocking. They see the phrase
exclusive product
and jump at the chance to order stock, sometimes going so far that you end up with the same stock for a whole year. The Siege Rescue Patrol says hi. If you hop onto eBay right now, you can still find this figure sealed for retail price. And these aren't resellers. These are retailers still trying to clear out the original stock from 5 years ago. There are very few second-hand copies out there, not because he's rare, but because nobody bought the damn thing. Nobody wanted him, and it's certain nobody wants him now. Compare that to Super Megatron, sitting at just under double his retail price. He was pretty widely available on release with a solid pre-order window and plenty of stock for weeks, even with the issues surrounding the pandemic. But now he's beginning to show his rarity. This is the mark of a successful exclusive. Does it suck that people who missed out can't get it? Absolutely, but at least it gave the fandom what they wanted, and at least something like this exists, and not another one of these. Exclusive slots are going to exist no matter what, and ultimately if it's a choice between a Diaclone release being an exclusive, or this guy being an exclusive and the Diaclone release just doesn't exist, I know what I'm taking. Yes, it isn't perfect, and international stock could be a lot better. They should also push stores to re-release certain figures, since they'd be received very well, but require exclusive licensing deals. But at the end of the day, look at what we're getting. Life is good, fellas. It certainly wasn't in the past. But as always, fandom public consciousness is a conversation, so drop what you think about this figure and exclusives in general below. Would you rather exclusives not exist at all, even if it means not getting obscure characters? Might sound extreme, but there are people who think so, and I'd like to hear more about this review. Or perhaps you've got a soft spot for weird and wacky figures like this. Who knows? And as always, there's a context for everything. Till next time.